Hello, everyone, and welcome to Monster Monday for April 5th, 2021. I'm your host, DM Gallibond. And tonight, we are going to be looking at part 4. Yes, part 4 of our series on goblins. And tonight, we're going to be looking at goblins from other intellectual properties, other IPs, other sources. Why would we do that on a show about D&D? Well, we're doing that to kind of give you, especially those of you that are relatively new DMs, the ability to sort of think outside of the rules as written and give your goblins a personality other than what it says in the Monster Manual. Because, God love them, D&D goblins, they're just kind of one-dimensional. They're sort of just angry all the time, and they just want to go around killing things and taking slaves. And there's not a whole lot to them. And you know what? In a dungeon crawl, that's great. Bad guys, one-dimensional, have at it. But if goblins are going to be more of a part of your game, like when we talk about next week, when we talk about an entire campaign where goblins are the antagonist all the way from tier 1 through tier 4, you want to have a little bit more depth and a little bit more nuance to your goblins. So by looking at how goblins work in other IPs, you can sort of pick and choose and figure out which one or which several sources you want to draw from. Before we get started, just want to go ahead and say a special thanks, as always, to Mo over at the Tabletop Bellhop. Mo is the OG when it comes to everything for tabletop games. Board games, party games, card games, tabletop RPGs, you name it. He's got everything you can think of about tabletop games over at Tabletop Bellhop, including a whole galaxy of podcasts and streams and everything that talk about individual games, everything from the development side to industry news to reviews of games that are coming out to people that are doing podcasts of actually playing through some of these games. All right, so we're going to focus exclusively on sources outside of D&D tonight, and we're going to start where goblins originated, and that is in folklore. So we'll take a look at goblins from folklore, and here is a Wikipedia illustration of a goblin from an ancient source. A goblin is a monstrous creature that appears in a folklore of multiple European countries, first in stories from the Middle Ages. They describe various and conflicting abilities, temperaments, and appearances, depending on the story of country of origin, but almost universally small, grotesque, mischievous, or outright malicious, and greedy, especially greedy for gold and jewelry. They often have magical abilities similar to a fairy or a demon, and similar creatures in folklore include brownies, dwarves, duendes, gnomes, imps, and kobolds. And of course, if you look at that list, you think, wow, those are all completely different things in D&D. But yeah, they all kind of have a similar origin story when it goes back to folklore origins from the Middle Ages. All right. Then goblins from literature. So there's, of course, goblins in all kinds of fantasy literature, and there's no way that this could be exhaustive. So if you think of a book that you've read that features goblins, that's something outside of the D&D universe, and you think, wow, I really like the way goblins are in there, then feel free to go for that. But I'm just looking at 3 very, very popular sources. Number 1, probably the source that had the biggest influence on Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax when they were developing D&D, is J.R.R. Tolkien and his Middle Earth setting. So The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings all were set in this mythical world that Tolkien created called Middle Earth. Goblins and orcs in his world were very similar creatures, and they kind of, you can see that sort of one-dimensional origin that they have in D&D from his works. They're tribal, they're brutish, they're vile, they're evil, and they're destructive. That's kind of all goblins are. They're just storybook bad guys thrown in there, and it's easy to root for the heroes against them because there's no sort of shades of gray to goblins in Tolkien. Now, this one I throw in, and I say it's a popular source. It may not be as popular unless you studied literature in college. Not sure they teach this very much in high school because it's a little bit racy for high school. But Christina Rossetti, one of the Victorian poets, she has a poem called The Goblin Market. And basically it's about, it's told from the perspective of this girl who goes to the goblin market and is tempted by all of these earthly desires that are represented by the goblin men that are from the goblin market. And it's, even reading it in the 21st century is pretty racy stuff. So if you're into that sort of thing, take a look at Christina Rossetti and her poem The Goblin Market. It's a very interesting take on goblins, and you might be able to think, could those guys be sort of the ones that just offer, if you will, the forbidden fruit to the party? You can figure out how maybe you might want to use that in your game. And then, of course, looking back at the last 20 years, we have to look at Harry Potter. We have to look at the Harry Potter books. Goblins in the Harry Potter universe are a race of very highly intelligent magical creatures. Short and dark-skinned, they've established themselves as a vital part of wizarding society. They're in charge of the Gringotts, one of the... I think that's one of like the marketplaces or places where they make magical items or something like that in the Harry Potter universe. They control wizarding economy to a large extent, and in addition to being clever with money and finances, goblins are also very capable metalsmiths. Oh, Gringotts, I guess that must be the bank. They've got the small ugly, but in this case, it turns them into very clever and shrewd sort of financiers, arcane smiths, arcane craftsmen, very, very smart and very helpful creatures in the Harry Potter universe. So goblins don't have to be dumb in your world. They can be really smart, and they can kind of be there and in control. And I almost think, like, with the timeline of when Harry Potter came out, I almost feel like the goblins in that universe were maybe a little bit inspired by the Ferengi from Star Trek, because and then in a certain way, it kind of feels like the Ferengi in Star Trek were sort of inspired by myths of goblins and other popular culture references to goblins turned a little bit on their head, because obviously the Ferengi were a spacefaring race, and they were like, all about the laws of acquisition and all about economics and everything like that. Okay, now Goblins in video games. I mean, if you've played a video game in the last 20, 25 years, you've run across goblins. I should say if you've played any kind of RPG, but even a lot of fantasy settings for FPS games and RTS games and stuff like that, there's goblins in there. Now, if we go back to one of the earliest MMORPGs, EverQuest, there you find goblins in there. They're a race of evil NPCs that harass adventurers in many starting zones. And there's even a couple of goblin-oriented dungeons, the most famous of which was Running Eye Citadel. If you started off that game, if you played a character that was a halfling, one of the ways out of your city went across this little idyllic field and then right into basically a goblinoid kingdom called the Kingdom of Runny Eye, and sort of the Runny Eye Citadel. And as you leveled up a little bit from initially, one of the ways you could go and get some decent loot and some experience was to go camp the front gate of Runny Eye Citadel and just kill the guards that would show up there. Now, Elder Scrolls games, there's goblins in the Elder Scrolls games. They are small humanoid creatures that live in various pockets across the world of Tamriel, where that's set. They're often found living in clans and appear to be somewhat related to Mare, which is another race. So they're kind of evil. Most of the time you run into goblins there in Elder Scrolls, you're having to fight them. Okay, and then, of course, probably the thing that most people who've played video games in the last 20 years are familiar with, the granddaddy of MMORPGs, at least to date, being World of Warcraft. Now, goblins started off as a non-playable race, and if you were on the Horde side, you ran into goblins right from the beginning of the game because they were sort of steampunk engineers. They were merchants. They would sell a lot of gear and everything to you. They would buy stuff from you. And then eventually, people started enjoying the goblin NPC so much that eventually Blizzard turned them into a playable race with their own complete backstory and everything like that. And if you were on the opposite faction, which is the Alliance faction, you had gnomes that occupied very much the same niche. Although gnomes started as a playable race from day one, you had gnomes on one side being sort of the steampunk engineer types, goblins on the other side were the steampunk engineers, and they kind of have always fulfilled that sort of niche. Now, I don't think the Thursday game has really run into goblins a whole lot, and I don't think the Sunday game has run into goblins a whole lot, but in my version of D&D, World of Warcraft goblins really have a big influence on the way my goblins manifest in my D&D game. They are, yes, they can be warlike and antagonistic against the PCs, but most of the goblins in my game, they kind of always talk a little bit like the goblins in World of Warcraft. To get the voice, it's kind of a little bit of Brian Johnson from AC/DC, and a little bit of I don't know, who else would that be? Maybe a little bit of old Andy Kaufman, and just kind of pitch your voice up a little bit, put a little bit of distortion in it, kind of talk from the back of your throat a bit, and throw in a little inappropriate laugh every now and then, and that's goblins. And so in the games where the PCs do wind up interacting with goblins on any kind of a extended basis, they usually find that goblins respond well to gold or silver. Goblins in my game can be bought, and you may run into a group of goblins, especially if it's a relatively small group of goblins, if they are beholden to some locally powerful-ish warlord, at least from the goblins' point of view, and the party wipes them out, and the party wants to talk to them, and then they figure out, oh, maybe the party will actually pay them, then goblins are easily bought, and they can just as quickly become allies as they are adversaries in my game, because I kind of like that idea of goblins being a bit mercenary and a bit free-spirited and kind of chaotic in the sense of, well, yesterday we were getting meat and not being beaten up by the big bugbears because we were doing what they were saying. But now the bugbears are dead and these adventurers want to pay us. So we'll follow these guys. So that's kind of where I come from when I am creating goblins in my games. Now, another source for goblins that actually comes from the other side of the house of Wizards of the Coast is goblins in the card game Magic the Gathering. All right, so goblins have a wide range of variations in the Magic the Gathering setting. Now, in the Sunday game, we are playing in the plane of Kamigawa currently, and there's a whole culture of goblins called the Aki in that plane, and those are the most peculiar goblins I've ever seen. They actually grow kind of bony shells like turtles on their backs, and they look kind of like a goblin crossed with a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle in terms of their artwork. But they're also kind of mischievous, and they're clever. They have a little bit of that whole steampunk engineering thing that you get from World of Warcraft. And then in Ravnica, they are part of the Izzet League. The Izzet League is primarily made up of gnomes and goblins. And their philosophy is tinker with it until something blows up. They are the most creative, the most experimental, and the most hazardous group of people in the Ravnica setting, because they're literally not happy until something goes boom. And yes, they don't want to be the one that's there when it goes boom, but they want to be close enough so they can see it go boom. So it's kind of that sort of thing, and that applies to goblins and gnomes equally in that particular expansion of the game. They're just comic relief, basically. And then most often they're depicted as kind of bumbling, a little bit humorous, warlike creatures that are as much a danger to themselves as they are to their enemies. Goblin Piker is a great example. I think it is a card that has been reprinted many, many times. I think it first showed up back in the original setting of Magic the Gathering, which is the Plane of Dominaria. And, it's just a simple goblin warrior. And the flavor text kind of gives you all you need to know about him. Once he'd worked out which end of the thing was sharp, he was promoted to guard duty. So it's sort of like, oh, what does this do? Hey, it's sharp on that end. Yeah, okay, you go stand over there and guard. That's kind of what they do with goblins in Magic the Gathering. So, or at least in one flavor of Magic the Gathering, you can go and you can look at all kinds of different inspiration. So I hope, as you can see from this, and yes, this is a little bit of a shorter edition tonight, unless there's questions from the chat room. There's a little bit shorter episode, but there's such a huge wide variety of influences that you can draw from. And the thing that's always great about D&D, being collaborative storytelling, is that your game, out of necessity, because it's you and it's the players that are sitting at your table, your game is going to be a unique version of the D&D story of this particular module that nobody else is ever going to experience quite the same way. And when you have a group of players, one of the ways of keeping them engaged is bringing them sort of memorable archetypes. And I tend to try to do that by I kind of think about the race, and I try to think about, well, what is this race like? And I do get myself in trouble because in the setting, and I'll admit, the current Kamigawa setting, there's so many different races. I wind up kind of losing track of which race has which sort of personality. But goblins, I played World of Warcraft for so many years that it just kind of imprinted on me, well, that's kind of the way goblins ought to be. And I can't help myself when there are goblins in my game. They sort of come out with the World of Warcraft voice and the World of Warcraft mannerisms and sort of the World of Warcraft personality. But you may be completely different. You may be somebody, if you're a little younger than I am, that grew up on Harry Potter. You just couldn't wait till the next book came out and you had to find out what was going on. And so you may think of goblins as these clever, clever, smart, financial wizards that are really good arcane craftsmen. Or you might come at it from, if you're my age or perhaps even a little bit older, you might have grown up with goblins in J.R.R. Tolkien, and so you might just think of them as those one-dimensional, warlike, tribal creatures, which is fine. And if your players are only going to interact with them because they are an obstacle in the dungeon, it's great. But if you can take that one-dimensional creature and find one little wrinkle that you can give them and one sort of little hook that your players can tap into when they interact with them, so it's not just always every time you meet something you gotta fight it, that can really help to bring those NPCs alive. And you might find that your players have a lot of fun interacting with NPCs that normally they wind up, going sword to sword against or spell to spell against. So that's just kind of the what I'm hoping to get across tonight with this look at goblins from other sources. Okay, here we talk a little bit more about what I've already discussed. I guess you take a look at the Magic the Gathering goblins mixed with the steampunk World of Warcraft goblins and throw in a little bit of the Three Stooges for good measure. I kind of like that fact that the goblins are, they're trying, but they're not always the sharpest knives in the drawer. And so try to give them a little bit personality. As an example, in a recent Saturday game that I finished, we played through the Lost Mine of Phandelver, but we played through it with the original D&D rules. And if you have played through that adventure, you know that one of the first things they encounter is goblins that are led by a bugbear named Clark. Now, we had a magic user in that game, and in first edition D&D, magic users get one spell every day. So in her spell book, she had the choice of sleep, she had a choice of charm person, and she had a choice of magic missile. And she could only ever memorize one each day. And so the party had kind of done some scouting, and they realized, oh, there's a powerful bugbear in this area. And so the magic user says, you know, if we wait until tomorrow to go in there, I'm going to memorize charm person. Because she had read the rules of the way charm person works in that edition, and if it's a not very bright opponent that you charm, like a bugbear, they get an initial saving throw, but they don't get another saving throw for 30 days. So you get the potential to charm this guy and have it following you around like a puppy dog for a whole month. And because Clark was the leader of all the goblins, there was one faction of goblins that wanted to overthrow Clark, but once they charmed Clark, that meant all the other goblins in the cave, once they dealt with the rebel faction, they were now followers of the party too. So they went through the entire adventure having Clark and the initial goblins follow them along. The goblins got to start to become sort of useful servants, and when they started doing stuff for the party started paying them. And then everywhere that they went where there were other goblins, well, Clark and the goblins that were with them, they would kind of go around and they would whisper to hey, why don't you come with us? These guys will actually pay you. You know, they won't throw you to the, they won't beat you and whip you and, cut you with weapons and throw you to the monsters when you do something wrong. They'll actually pay you and feed you. And we've got a nifty place in town that we're rebuilding as a stronghold. So yeah, come and join us. So they wound up ending that game with like a whole army. I think there was like 3 or 4 bugbears, about 3 or 4 hobgoblins, and then probably 20 or more goblins that were all just sort of retainers and hangers-on and followers of the party by the time they got done with that. When they got to it made sort of the final climactic battle of that adventure a little bit anticlimactic, because by the time they encountered the Black Spider, basically all the goblinoids were following the party, and the Black Spider didn't have any allies. So he had to fight for his life, and then he had to escape. They didn't wind up killing him, but they wound up defeating him because he wound up escaping and claiming that he was going to come back with more dark elves of his kind. But the players opted not to continue that storyline, so we don't know whether he ever will or not. All right. Next week, when we come back, we will be looking at the 5th and final part of our series on goblins, and that is building a campaign around goblinoid enemies. We're going to talk about how you could create a D&D campaign where the major antagonists are goblins all the way from tier 1 through tier 4. And we saw last week when we were looking a little bit at the religion and the society of goblins. You can find the archives over on my YouTube channel. We saw how, there's all of these various different strata of goblins and how they are very organized, especially when you have like hobgoblins being sort of the military leadership of a goblinoid society, or a goblinoid nation, if you will. And if you can imagine a game world where maybe all of the civilized people live in this part of the continent, and then there's just sort of frontier, wilderness, unknown beyond it. But maybe then one day they start getting reports from rangers that there's like a huge host of goblinoids that's coming this way. I mean, you could have like the goblinoids that are going to be creating or expanding a monstrous humanoid empire. And that might be kind of the entire story of your campaign, is how your heroes help to stave off the advance of these goblinoids. Because maybe there's something behind that expansion. Maybe they're not being greedy. Maybe they're running away from something. And, but initially, you're just going to find all these monstrous humanoids that are starting to run across paths with sort of the outlying settlements in the frontier, and you got to go deal with them. But then as you get more and more in depth to it, you're going to get deeper and deeper into the story. So we'll talk a little bit about how you can set something like that up as an extended protagonist for a campaign in D&D. All right. I'm looking at the chat right now. I don't see any questions. And yes, hey, Louisa, good to see you there. Yeah, I believe you're right. I believe that Gringotts was the bank in Harry Potter. All right, I'm going to go into the wrap-up, but I'm going to come back and check to see if anybody has any questions on the on goblins or different sources for goblins, or any ideas about other influences for goblins or other ways that you could give goblins personalities than what we've talked about here today. All right, I've been DM Gallibond, and I do 4 streams every week. I do this stream on Monday nights. It's my only one mic stream. Then I have 3 actual play games that I do. Actually, 2 actual play games and 1 upcoming game. Sundays afternoons, we do the Walker of Waterdeep. We had an epic battle yesterday in that game that I was really, really proud of. The enemy I threw at them turned out to be every bit as hard as I thought that enemy was going to be, and it taxed them in all of their resources to be able to defeat it. And you'll have to listen to tomorrow's YouTube recap to find out, or go back and watch the stream from yesterday on YouTube to find out if they got through that fight unscathed. Then on Thursday nights, there's the Sword Coast Chronicles. That's a sort of a love letter to the published 5th edition campaigns. Right now, we are dipping into the storyline of Curse of Strahd, and they are in the demiplane of Barovia in that game. And then on Saturdays, like I said, we finished up the Lost Mine of original D&D, and we are deciding what we're going to play next. And as of this past Saturday, we have settled on we're going to play a 2nd edition game that starts in the setting of Greyhawk. However, the party or the players really are fond of some of the other IPs, so they've asked me if there's any way that I can work in a little bit of Ravenloft, a little bit of Dragonlance, a little bit of Dark Sun, and perhaps a little bit of Planescape. So I've got some ideas. I know how it's going to start, and this Saturday we are going to begin the process of building characters for that game. So 7:30 p.m. I was really surprised. This last Saturday we had like 9 people that watched us for 2 hours debate what setting we're going to be in and how we're, sort of what we're going to do to start the game. We weren't really playing or anything, but people showed up and wanted to find out. So if you're one of those people that likes seeing sort of how the sausage is made when it comes to people deciding on a campaign and deciding how to create a campaign, that's an option for you to show up on Saturday night and look at that. All of those streams are over on Twitch, twitch.tv Gallibond. All of the archives of everything, except for this whole sausage making on Saturday night. I'm not posting archives from that. I'm recording it for my benefit, but I'm not. I'm streaming it and recording it while I stream it for my benefit, but I'm not posting it because I think it would just be boring watching. And then if you really want to help us out, help us be able to eventually do more stuff, upgrade equipment and do things like that, we do have a Patreon over at patreon.com/dmgallibond. All right, I'm going to look back here. All right, Casca says, did I miss you saying that Tolkien, goblins, and orcs are the same thing? Well, I mentioned that they're very similar in Tolkien. Now, I have seen a couple of fan sites that that sort of say that orcs and goblins are almost two different names for the same kind of creatures. They seem to occupy slightly different niches in Tolkien's stories, but to be honest, I'm the kind of fan of places that I'll go and I'll read the actual stories, but I never went in for reading like the Silmarillion. I think that's what it's called, where Tolkien kind of details all of the lore that essentially forms the backstory for The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, and I think he goes great in depth about all of the different races and everything. But I just never read that. It was like, okay, I kind of like the stories, the adventure. At that point in time, I really wasn't looking into all of where he came from to build all of that stuff. But I read Tolkien when I was in middle school, so I just really didn't have time for all that. I just wanted to figure out where the story was going. So a lot of fan sites will say they're very similar, but if somebody wanted to pin you down and try to tell you that they're exactly the same, I would ask them to give you more than just, well, they're the same because I read it somewhere. And, give more details. Why do you say they're the same? All right, Luis, take care. Talk to you later. Okay, all right, everyone. Thank you so much. It looks like that's about it for the questions. I am so glad you guys hung out tonight. Really appreciate you being here. And I hope that we will see you next time on Monster Monday. And I will close the same way that I always do by reminding you to watch out for the monsters under the bed. Good night, everybody. Okay, well, the music is going. I am over here. I'm going to be looking to see if there's if there's anybody else from the, come on, darn it. Anybody else from the small streamer community that is streaming tonight, and we'll go ahead and we will raid them. Oh. We got some artwork going on. Lord of the Rings Online. Oh, okay. Lord of the Rings Online. I think given tonight's topic, that makes sense. So we'll go ahead and we'll raid Mage Centron. Alright everyone, thank you guys so much for hanging out tonight. Hope you have a great week. And we will talk to you next week. Good night everybody.